Welcome to this special episode of Justice Above All, a podcast where we just don't talk about civil rights. We connect historical movements to the present day. I'm your host, Carla McAnders, director of the Thurgood Marshall Institute with the Legal Defense Fund. We're live, we're real, and we're unfiltered today at the CBCF 54th Annual Legislative Conference. And I have with me Memphis County Mayor Lee Harris and LDF Policy Counsel Louis Bedford IV. So I want to set the stage before we get started. Across the country, we're seeing something deeply troubling. The federal government is deploying the National Guard, with some governors helping to pave the way. Black-led cities are being stripped of their power under the guise of saving them. Officials claim crime or dysfunction, and then they move in with the state police, and then they try to deploy the National Guard. So my first question for both of you is, we keep hearing about these headlines about crime surges and unsafe streets. But when those headlines are used to justify seizing control of Black-led cities, what's actually going on beneath the surface? I'll start with you, Mayor Harris.
Oh, well, sure. And great to be here. Thanks for having me. So Shelby County, where I serve as the top official, is the largest county in the state of Tennessee, about 1 million residents, 7 cities. Our county seat is Memphis. We're the most diverse county. And I think that plays a role in, some of the targeting that we've heard lately from Donald Trump and others about a takeover of Memphis and Shelby County with National Guard, military, or whoever else he needs, to quote Donald Trump. So what I think is happening is, I think this is bigger. I mean, I'm just going to be honest. I know this isn't partisan, and I'm not trying to be partisan, but when I really think about the takeover of our community, or the threat of takeover, what I see is a takeover of the country, because this is not going to stop in Chicago or in LA or Washington, D.C. I think you'll see this in other places. And so the goal is to really militarize these areas, to keep people home and paralyzed in place, such as they don't come out and protest. And that leads to a larger goal of, trying to undermine elections in 2026 and maybe stand in office through 2028, because that's one of the ways you do it, is because an objection to that kind of change in American norms would come from the grassroots, would come from the protest community. And so the best way to get people afraid to do that kind of thing is to, have a National Guard on their street. No one's coming out to protest if they see an armored vehicle or a semi-automatic weapon or any of those things on their corner.
So Memphis is a microcosm of what is going to be happening nationally if we don't stop it here.
100%. This will be the roadmap that you'll see applied to community after community across the country. And, I believe that there's a lot of, Trump and others are really testing us to see how we will respond in these really, really crisis moments. And so one of the tests is a test of the military. And it's a test to see whether or not the military will refuse unlawful orders. And so I think we've seen that maybe not, right? Maybe not, right? We saw Venezuelans who were executed without due process, which is something that's out of the American tradition. And the militaries didn't refuse. If Donald Trump ordered their execution, military personnel complied. And so he's testing, how far can he go before somebody refuses? And if no one refuses and he controls the military, there is nothing we can do. So I don't want to paint the dark picture here, but you have to understand, if he controls the military, that's it. There's nothing we can do. He can do a lot of things to really undermine a lot of American traditions. So starting off on a dark note, hopefully I'll get a chance to lighten it up here at some point.
Well, what's going on?
Well, to the mayor's point, this is definitely about power and doing whatever you possibly can in order to be able to consolidate power. Because if you actually look at the actual language, whenever it comes to crime, that's actually not the case. For example, Memphis ended up putting out the fact that there was a report that this is some of the lowest crime rates whenever it comes to homicides in the past 25 years. Chicago also ended up doing the same. In fact, in the city of Chicago, there is a 33% decrease in homicides from this year to last year. That's also the case. We've seen crime lows in Washington, D.C. We've seen crime lows in Baltimore. We've seen crime lows in Los Angeles. But at the same time, that's the very same cities where the president of the United States wants to be able to send the National Guard. Yeah. So you have to ask the question, what is this really about? And the reality is, just like the mayor was saying, this is about undermining our democratic institutions. It's about consolidating power, and it's about doing something to be able to benefit a very small few to the detriment of so many of us. That is the reality of where we are.
Definitely. Thank you. So let's pull on this thread of the narrative of crime. I know in Memphis, it's complicated.
Yeah.
So can you talk us through what is actually going on with the crime rate in Memphis? And does this proposed remedy, is it proportional to what's going on in Memphis?
All right. So obviously, we all want to see crime come down. There's no doubt about it. And we have seen, as just mentioned, some reductions in crime, and we would love to see more. But I think what really happens if you intervene with military forces in communities, all you do is suppress activity. So you don't suppress crime. So you may see some reduction in crime statistics, but those are not reductions in criminality. All those are reductions in people going out, right? And so if more people are staying home, if more people are not going downtown or midtown Memphis, see the Grizzlies game, go to Beale Street, because they're waiting for this moment to pass. If you have a diverse community like ours and you have Latinos that no longer go to church, in fact, church services will be canceled at many churches for the duration of the military being in town because of fear. So if you have all those things happening, activity suppressed, that means there are fewer kind of just relationships. People are not going out, nothing's happening. And so necessarily there'll be a fewer conflicts, and necessarily, less for everybody to do, less for businesses to do, but also less for cops to do. So that's really all that it is. If we were really to do something about crime in Memphis and Shelby County, there's a lot of ways to do it. I could talk about them all day, but one I'll mention at the state level, because the governor plays a role in this too, right? It's Governor Bill Lee. And he's really been, in my view, not a strong defender of our community. One of the things he could do is have a real conversation around the proliferation of guns in our community, because Tennessee allows more Second Amendment gun rights than any state in the union. And so it started with, guns in parks, to guns in cars, to now we have what I call guns in on street corners. The idea that you can have constitutional carry, permitless carry, with no regard. In other words, police, you could have a gun on your side, any street corner in Memphis, and the police can't ask you about your gun, right? It's illegal. They can't ask you any question about why you have a gun on any street corner in Memphis. And so because of that proliferation in Memphis and Shelby County, we have seen an explosion of the amount of guns that people are carrying and that they leave in their cars. And so as a practical matter, as more people leave guns in their cars, like, they have guns with them and they throw them in their cars, you see more break-ins in cars, and you see more guns end up in the criminal stream because of all those break-ins and the search for guns in cars, because there's so many more. So our statistics on that front have gone through the roof. There's so many guns on the street now because of the change in our laws to allow anybody to carry a gun anywhere, which has caused just a search for these guns through the cars. And now we've seen, an explosion of our crime as a result of that. So we'd love to see Governor Lee have a conversation about, the proliferation of guns. And that would make a huge impact immediately, a long-term immediate impact on crime rates throughout our communities.
So needless to say, that issue is not being addressed by the deployment of the National Guard and State Highway Patrol.
No, not at all. I mean, no, the guns in cars and the guns in parks and guns on street corners, not at all. Tennessee has swung really far right. And again, I'm not trying to be partisan, but it's true in America that you have to have a real good conversation, which means you got to have two healthy parties in our country. So Tennessee is not in that place right now. 2006 to 2008, we were Democratic. And then after 2008 or so, majority Republican. And now we've swung so hard right that it's hard to have a serious conversation about issues without it becoming kind of a hard right partisan conversation. And so again, that's just not healthy, and that's kind of where we are in our state.
So Louis, we know that state legislatures have taken over cities, Black-led cities. Can you talk to us a little bit about that and how it compares to this moment?
Well, first and foremost, I think it's very important to be able to understand what a state takeover is. That is whenever a state ultimately ends up occupying, whether it's a police system, whether it's an education system, or trying to change some of the institutions that are happening in some of America's cities. So first and foremost, this is happening not just in one particular city, but this is happening across the country. For example, in Jackson, Mississippi, the state ended up creating a separate legal system where there were individuals who ended up being charged with misdemeanors who ended up needing to go to state jails, state prisons rather than a local jail. But we've also seen this happen in Texas as well. The state of Texas ended up taking over Houston ISD, and the state is going to end up controlling that school system until 2027 and possibly beyond. And the unfortunate reality, this happens time and time again. And even in the state of Georgia, the Georgia State Election Board also tried to create new rules that could end up changing how Fulton County ends up voting. And so I think that is something that is very important to note, because this is not something that is based on one particular institution. This is something that very much impacts each and every system that we interact with every day. But we do have to ask ourselves a question that if a state or if the federal government could end up taking over an institution in a particular city, or end up taking away the power of Black citizens inside of various cities, what does that say about our collective democracy on the whole? What does it say about our ability to be able to have a government of the people and by the people? So I think that's something that's very important to be able to note, because if these are able to happen on the local level and we don't say anything, and they happen at the state level and we don't say anything, whenever it comes to, just like the mayor was saying, it happens at the federal level and we also don't say anything, what is going to be ultimately left of our institutions?
Exactly. Absolutely. So this has been growing over time.
Very much so. And this is also something that has happened post-Civil War. There were also multiple instances where after the Civil War, where Black people started to be able to get more rights, there were very real efforts in order to try to strip those rights away. And so we're seeing that over the course of history. This is not new. This is something that has happened over the course of history. It happened after the Civil War. It happened in the 80s. It happened in the 90s. And unfortunately, it's also happening today as well.
Mayor Harris, I want to shift a little bit. Can you walk us through the timeline of the federal government saying that it was going to take over Shelby County and Memphis?
Sure, absolutely. So Donald Trump, one Friday, got on Fox and Friends. And I think as we sit here, that may have been, a couple of Fridays ago. And so he got on Fox and Friends and he said he's sending the troops to Memphis. And that announcement on Fox and Friends, which could have been spur of the moment, because some of the history and our experience with this president suggests that there may not be a lot of planning going on, but those comments on Fox and Friends set this whole thing in motion. And those comments were pretty reckless and very unspecific. So he said, I'm going to send the National Guard. This is almost a quote verbatim. I'm going to send the National Guard, the military, and whoever else I want to Memphis and Shelby County in order to, do whatever he says he's going to do, and the promise of zero crime. And the next thing we know, he has a press conference at the White House with a whole bunch of individuals around him. And at this one, he says, I'm going to send a big force down there. So again, this has set in motion all sorts of fears and panic and created what is, in effect, a crisis in our community. Just these words without a lot of thought or planning from the president at these press conferences. And so we've got some of our most important kind of cultural community institutions who are fearful of what that looks like and how that will damage their reputation and our community's reputation for years to come. Like, what does it look like to have an image of an armored vehicle on Beale Street, our most important tourist attraction, 3 to 4 million visitors a year? What does it look like to have a picture of semi-automatic weapons in front of the Memphis Grizz, right? In front of the FedEx Forum where the Memphis Grizz play. Or in front of Graceland or the Memphis Zoo. I mean, there's just a lot of history and a lot of important assets that need to be preserved in Memphis. And this is going to be a stain on our reputation for years to come. And for what? Donald Trump pulls down these cities for his own purposes, maybe a distraction from other news and so forth. But these cities and communities like mine will have to bear the impact of it for years to come. At the same time, we know the governor's going to play a role, but we don't know what yet. The governor's really been very unclear. So, he says he's going to start sometime soon, and it's going to last. Well, first he said he wasn't going to do it. He said he's not going to do it. Then he switched because Donald Trump told him to do it and said he is going to do it. And then it was going to be for a certain duration, and now we're hearing it'll be for indefinite. So it's unclear right now. Our governor has not had a press conference in Tennessee to discuss this. He's certainly not coming to Memphis to have a press conference to discuss this. And this has been, 2 weeks of crisis, and we have not heard from him. The only time we've seen our governor is in the Oval Office, and Donald Trump, I think, gave him a minute or two to speak during an Oval Office visit. But they took no questions. And again, there's been no communication to the public that would be relevant, from our governor, and certainly no communication in our city.
I want to go back to what you said about this being kind of a stain on Memphis's history, and go back to like 1968 when there were, the National Guard in Memphis. How are Memphians, is that how you say it? How are Memphians feeling given that history of the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King in Memphis? And that was kind of the last big time that the National Guard was in Memphis.
Right. So Memphis, it has a long civil rights legacy. Obviously, that's the place where Martin Luther King was assassinated on April 4th. And we're the home of the National Civil Rights Museum, one of our real good, important cultural assets. And it tells the story of the civil rights era. And it's housed at the Lorraine Motel, which is where Dr. King was shot. I think a lot of Memphians right now are, and that is how you say Memphians. I think a lot of Memphians just don't know what to think at this point. I think they want strong leadership, and I don't think they've gotten that from our governor. They want to, really believe that he has their best interests at heart, but they've heard very little from him, and certainly haven't seen him. He said he was going to come to Memphis and talk about this. That hasn't happened, and we'll see what happens going forward. So I think people are anxious. I think that it has created a lot of tension, and a lot of folks don't know what the details are, and so they don't know what to expect. I think if it is like anything like what we hear about what's going on in D.C., I think we're going to be troubled by it. I mean, if there really are checkpoints, then we know a lot of our diverse members of our diverse communities are going to get caught up in some of that. Checkpoints and dragnets and individuals who are probably not trained on due process, like our law enforcement officers who are extensively trained and have, just like I'm sure DC police, the training for city police force is way beyond other law enforcement agencies because they deal with unique clientele. So we're all afraid of what that looks like, what that dragnet looks like, and how people's rights are going to be compromised. But we're waiting to see right now, and so it's still more to come.
So Louis, can you take us to why majority Black cities? Why is the federal government targeting?
Well, I think oftentimes people like to be able to say that Black people are the canaries in the coal mine, so to speak, whenever it comes to a lot of the issues that we end up seeing. For example, whenever it comes to the increasing unemployment rate, we've seen Black women being the most affected by unemployment in this country. Same thing with Black men. But whenever it comes specifically to these local takeovers, it's the fact that, what does it represent? It represents taking that power away from Black people, and Black people who end up electing individuals who end up representing their needs, end up representing their desires, their wants. But if you're able to, once again, strip the power away from those Black people who are having that voice, that also means that they're able to take it away from other people. And I think it's very important to be able to realize that connection between, if they're willing to take it away from us, they're willing to take it away from anybody. And so once again, what ends up happening in Memphis has a very real impact on what ends up happening across the country. And that is something that we definitely need to realize again and again, because it's real, and it's going to have a very real impact in each and every one of us.
So we're at an inflection point.
We incredibly are. And it happens over the course of history where there are inflection points time and time again. But I think something that's important to realize is that, once again, this is not new. This is a part of the fabric of America where we've had these frustrations, where we've had these tensions time and time again. But I think something that's very important is to realize that the history is also very, very recent as well. For example, whenever it comes to the conversations around desegregation in this country, We often think that happened very, very, very long ago. But then you see individuals such as Ruby Bridges. She's 71. There are individuals in Congress, probably roughly over 100 of them, that are older than she is.
Yeah.
What does that say about how close and how recent this history is, where we actually lived in a society where there were two separate systems for Black people and for white people? But the history of this country has made it very plain. Like, for example, there was a Supreme Court case, I believe it was Plessy versus Ferguson, where the Chief Justice ended up saying that there is no right that the Black man has that the white man has to like respect and observe. Yes. And I think that is something that's very important to be able to note, because that history is very much a part of the fabric of this country.
Definitely.
And if we ignore that history, then we also lack the true perspective that we need to have an understanding of where we're actually going.
And so in Memphis, what happens to a community politically and socially when the voters' choices at the local level are overwritten by the federal government?
Well, I think we're about to find out. I think we're really in unprecedented times here, so we'll see. I think one of the things that's got to happen is, if they're going to be National Guard, these National Guard troops have got to come from somewhere. And so if they come from Memphis, in other words, we have people that are reservists that serve in the National Guard and so forth that live in Memphis and Shelby County. If they come from our community, well, those people are typically our law enforcement officers.
Yeah.
So we would be taking our current law enforcement officials and correction officials and turning them over to someone else to be in charge of. That is not, as you say, somebody that was elected in Memphis and Shelby County. Or maybe those National Guards, we don't have the details, maybe those National Guards come from across our state. And so now if they come from across our state, from more rural communities and less diverse communities, now you've got troops that obviously aren't as trained as our cops, but in addition to that, don't necessarily understand some of the cultural makeup of Memphis and Shelby County. And so Memphis and Shelby County is more urban. And if they come from out of state, right, if you get other governors, other red meat, governors that decide that this is a great kind of thing to stand up for, and they're sending their troops to Memphis and Shelby County, it is quite possible that a lot of those troops will feel a signal that it's time to knock some heads around, because the governor of Alabama said, go clean up the border, the Mexican border. If you get a chance to see some action down there, you're gonna take it. And if they, in the same vein, if the governor of Alabama sends some troops to Memphis and Shelby County, not to build protections against a flood, not to evacuate a population in the case of a natural disaster, but instead to do policing activities, those troops might get the wrong signal. So I think, and again, at the same time, the local officials, the civilian authority that would ordinarily be in place to be in charge of that, will be divested from some of that power. And so, it feels like we should be very worried. I'm hopeful. I'm optimistic. So I know I'm painting a dark picture. I'm hopeful and I'm optimistic that it won't happen the way I think it'll happen.
Yeah.
And it might not. I might not. But I think we are on this slippery slope. And I think it's going to get worse and worse. But so we will just have to wait and see.
I think you're hitting on a key point, that public safety is a community-led initiative. And when you have people coming in from the outside, that it's not public safety and it's not community-driven. And I think it's important for our listeners to know that. So, Louis, what would it look like to build stronger federal protections that empower rather than undermine Black mayors in their cities? And what is LDF doing about this right now? Well,
first and foremost, I think it's important if the federal government and local communities were to work hand in hand, trying to figure out what do those local communities actually need, rather than the federal government telling those local communities what they want them to have. Or I'm going to tell you how your community actually looks without actually speaking to the people who live there, who work there, who lead there. And I think that's something that's incredibly important. But whenever it comes to LDF, we've been in this space for the past 85 years. We've been actively working on the ground in order to be able to make sure that Black people in this country are able to have the protections that they need. So it's not just what happens in Tennessee, it's also what ends up happening in Louisiana as well. For example, the Legal Defense Fund is bringing a case. Like, we are going to have an argument in front of the Supreme Court on October 15th to try to protect the voting rights of individuals in Louisiana. And that is just a very real part of what we do. But this is an ongoing effort by the organization that I'm very honored and privileged to be a part of, to actively work to make sure that we're able to push back against this administration that is actively trying to take people's rights away, from pushing back against Project 2025 to pushing back against some of the judicial nominations, to pushing back against the fact that over at HUD, fair housing laws are being taken away. And it's an active effort to push back as much as we can in every possible avenue that we can, because as LDF likes to say, we were built for this.
Exactly.
And so each and every one of us were built for this, to make sure that we were able to stand on the shoulders of our ancestors who were able to get us to this point. And I think it's very important to be able to recognize that, to let us also know that we are someone else's ancestors. People are going to be looking back at us to be able to see and show that we also did something. So, like I said before, I'm honored to be a part of LDF's legacy, but I'm also very honored to know that I'm going to be someone else's ancestor that they're going to be look back on and hopefully be very proud of.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think this leads us to our last question. You mentioned that LDF is celebrating its 85th anniversary this year, and we've spent the last 85 years dreaming, defending, and disrupting for civil rights. And our goal is to create a multiracial democracy. So to end, Lewis and Mayor Harris, can you name one? What is your dream, your defense, or your disruption in this very moment?
Sure. All right. And thanks for those comments, by the way, about court action. And we're going to try to do the same as well, because Tennessee has some special prohibitions against the use of the National Guard. And we believe that all of this flouts our state constitution. So we're going to also try to see if we can get into court and try to do what we can to challenge what we think is really, really in defiance of some of our Tennessee traditions and American traditions. So in terms of my dream, my dream in this moment, and I'm a pretty practical, moderate sensibility kind of guy, but my dream in this moment is one of resistance, to tell you the truth. And the reason is because, we all went to law school and so forth, and I taught at a law school, University of Memphis, for many years. And so one of the things that you kind of advise students and lawyers around is, what do you do if your ethical obligations are put in jeopardy? And most of the advice we give is you should resign if needed from a representation that puts those values at risk. I don't think resignation is enough in this moment. We need the Lisa Cooks of the world to not resign, to stay in office, to fight things that are unlawful, unconstitutional, or in defiance of American tradition. So we need people to refuse to comply in this moment. So that's my dream, is that more people refuse to comply. Thank you very much for having me. This has been a great conversation.
And Louis, what is your dream, defense, or disruption in this moment?
My dream is in solidarity. I'm very much a movie person, and I watch the Marvel movies just like anyone else my age. But there's a quote that I love from a movie from some years ago, and it says, "The price of freedom is high. It always has been, and it always will be. And if it's a price I'm willing to pay, and if I'm the only one, then so be it. But I'm willing to bet that I'm not." And I swear to the fact that I do not believe that I'm the only person who's willing to pay that, and do everything I possibly can in order to fight for the freedoms of each and every one of us. Because if we are not all free, then none of us truly are. And I think that is something that is incredibly important, that we have to remember time and time again. And earlier, before this ended up starting, we ended up talking about Frederick Douglass in Washington, D.C. And there's a quote from him that I love. It says, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will." And if we are able to move forward in solidarity, if we combine our power, then nothing is going to be able to stop us. And I think that's something that's incredibly important.
Well, thank you both for this wonderful conversation. Very informative, and we're keeping Memphis in our thoughts. And
thank you.
Yes, we will.
We, want to support and resist as we can going forward.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much.